they needed to go on this journey, and part of the journey is them learning about everything, learning about what's going on, learning what's actually happening. And part of it is them learning to live with each other, because they're sort of thrust in the situation where, and that goes into another question, of course, which, I'm not going to get into the character development just yet, but definitely they needed to learn to live together because, as far as they know, they're the only people who are left.
Hello and welcome to the podcast Homespun Script. I'm your host, Nate Knispel. My guest today is Cheryl Peña, author of several works of literature, including the science fiction novella The Chimera Gambit and the thriller titled The House of Wind Lift. Today, we will be discussing her dark science fiction novel, Descent of the Vile, the first in a two-book series. Descent narrates the activities of photographer Jackson Riley as he encounters a shocking turn of events which unfold in the wake of a very unusual photo shoot. Suddenly caught in a seemingly post-apocalyptic world with a mysterious woman named Nadine, both must navigate their way through a confusing and dangerous environment as they decipher what has happened. Here's Cheryl reading from the novel.
Carefully, Jackson took the equipment apart and carried it out to his case for storage and transport. That time, however, Devin seemed to realize that it would be faster if he held the door for Jackson to get everything out of the lab. It was quicker to dismantle the assembly than to set it all up. Jackson gingerly stored the camera and other equipment in the case, locked it, and then secured it to the luggage rack he had used to carry everything to the third-floor office. Lastly, he retrieved his tripod and waited for Devin to lock the door and escort him back down to ground level. "Can you find your way out?" Devin asked. "The last shuttle should be leaving soon." "Yes, thank you," Jackson replied, trying not to allow any resentment to color his tone, although he was annoyed that Devin wouldn't escort him back. Trying to ignore the headache that had threatened to explode on him shortly, he hurried across the concourse in the semi-darkness, hoping to catch the shuttle this time around. A few floodlights scattered around the complex barely illuminated the area with their sodium yellow glow. However, even though the sun had gone down, it was only marginally cooler than in the afternoon. As he reached the edge of the complex, he saw the shuttle driving away, to his utter disappointment. Frustrated, he rushed to chase it down, determined not to miss it again, barely reaching it and knocking on the back door to get the driver to stop. The shuttle slowed and then came to a halt, and Jackson felt relieved that he wouldn't have to walk the entire way back to his car toward the back of the expansive parking lot. The doors opened, and he checked behind him to see that he was able to bring the view camera case up onto the bottom step. Then he looked up, unable to believe what he saw. Every one of the occupants had a horrifying, ragged appearance, some of them with open wounds or blisters covering their exposed skins. A few of them were twitching in a manner that seemed almost mechanical, as if a machine were malfunctioning. Their blank stares turned toward him, and they watched him as he froze, not knowing what to do or what would happen. Somehow he could sense that they saw him as an outsider and that he didn't belong there. Holding his breath, not daring to move, he could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then they advanced on him. Although they didn't move quickly, he knew he was in danger. He was still standing against the door and had no space to retreat. So he yanked the emergency brake cord, backing out of the shuttle down the steps, and tripping over the camera case and tumbling out onto the concrete below. Ignoring his scraped arms, he only briefly considered grabbing the camera case, but bolted away instead, knowing he didn't have time. Running away, he saw more of these slow-moving, ragged-looking people ambling toward him from the direction he'd just come from, possibly hundreds of them. He sprinted across the parking lot, searching for his car in the nighttime gloom, and he only found it because it was situated under a floodlight. Panicking, he quickly found his keys in his pocket, but he dropped them in his haste to unlock the car. Frantically, he picked them up again and opened the door, starting the ignition, and looked for the exit. Then he gunned the engine and raced away from the buildings.
That sets it up pretty well, yeah. Sodium yellow glow actually sets the atmosphere really well. I've never heard that descriptor used for a streetlight before.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything really physically sodium in these streetlights?
I believe so. I've heard
Okay.
that there is sodium, and that's why they turn that color. So
Okay.
yeah, but so that's why I use that word, because I thought, oh well, that's descriptive. Everybody knows what the sodium lights look like.
Yep. I knew exactly what that color was and what the atmosphere was like. So
Mm.
cool. Anyway, so getting back a bit, Cheryl, thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure and privilege to talk with you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So, aside from the sodium yellow glow, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Well, I started writing at 3 years old. Before I could even actually write or read, I
Mm-hmm.
was writing stories, and I remember my sister and we would draw pictures and then memorize the story that went along to each picture, and we would kind of try to bind them together and with tape and stuff, because we were little, we were three, and then I think by the time I was in junior high and high school, I was writing lots of poetry and short stories. And I wrote a novel in high school that was really bad. So, but I was just enamored with reading and writing and everything just at a very early age. We practically lived at the library.
Mm-hmm.
And first published at 50.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of
Oh.
mine read one of my novellas, and she said, I think you should try to publish this. And I thought, oh no, nobody will want to publish this.
Mm-hmm.
And I pretty much submitted it to places because I wanted to prove her wrong. I just wanted her to see, hey, no, nobody
Yeah, they
wants
won't.
this. Yeah, but oh my God, she got the last word because somebody said
Yeah.
yes.
See, you did succeed. How about
Yes,
that?
exactly. Yeah. So yeah, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else I really want to. Well, I'm kind of a nerd. I'm a nerd,
Mhm.
and I shouldn't be ashamed to say it, but I'm definitely a nerd because I'm totally into sci-fi. I've always been into sci-fi.
Yeah. I
So
think that's a
yeah,
mark of honor right now,
right.
rather than
I
any
hope
kind of,
so.
yeah, yeah, especially in this podcast. Yes.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Such a nerd.
So a lot of your books, and we're going to be talking about the first book in your Descent of the Vile series today, or duology, but you've got a couple others as well, and it looks as though they're mostly, I haven't read the other two, the Chimera Gambit and the House of Wind Lift, and they look as though they're kind of sci-fi thrillers as well. How did you could maybe say a couple things about those before we get into Descent?
Yeah. Sure. Actually, the House of Wind Lift was written about 30 years ago,
Hmm.
and it
Oh,
was
wow.
a suspense thriller because
Hmm.
I remember I took a nap, which was a weird thing. I took a nap, and when I woke up, I had the basic premise and the title in my head. I don't even remember if I dreamed about it or it was so long ago. But it was the first thing I had in my head that wasn't sci-fi, and I thought, oh, I should probably write this down, and
Hmm.
and only because I was trying to not be so nerdy, and which
Hmm.
failed miserably. But anyway, so that one I wrote about 30 years ago, and that was the first one I got published because I thought, well, maybe I have a better chance with this one than the sci-fi stuff. I just didn't know much about publishing or anything.
Hmm.
And the Chimera Gambit I wrote because um, I think it probably was another dream I had actually that prompted that one. And it was, to me, more true to my nature, I guess, because I've always been interested in sci-fi and always been interested in um, not just space opera, but just about every different kind of sci-fi there is. And I love how varied the genre is. And I thought, well, this is kind of a story that can go. It's sort of space opera, but it's also got other elements in it as well. So
Hmm.
to me, that one was kind of like exploring what a sci-fi novella could be. I'm
Hmm.
not sure that it couldn't be expanded into a novel as well, but I wrote it as a novella.
Hmm.
Um, and I won't rule out going back to revisit the story again later.
Hmm. Cool. So, how did you get interested in science fiction?
Probably that was my parents' fault. I don't think they intended it.
All their fault, right?
Yeah, I don't think they intended it. I don't think they did it on purpose. But when I was a kid, we were always going to the drive-in movie theater
Hmm.
because it was the cheapest way we could all see a movie. Because we paid by the car instead of by the
Hmm.
person. And so, we saw Logan's Run and Soylent Green and all these classic sci-fi movies at the drive-in, and I just loved them. I don't know if my parents were as into the genre as I was, but we saw them anyway. I mean, and then my mom introduced me to Star Trek when I got a little older, and it was in syndication. It was science fiction theater, I remember, on Saturday nights, and she would get home from work really late, poor thing. And she stayed up late watching it one night, and my sister kind of was having trouble sleeping, and she went in there to see what she was doing. And then she came in there later and told me, you've got to see this show. It was really great. And I'm like, well, I don't know. She probably won't let me stay up, right? It was just because it was you. It was just one of us. But then we all ended up eventually staying up watching it. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we watched it. Was the Twilight Zone that came on first, but we didn't always catch the beginning of it. So we didn't always know what was happening. But if we caught the beginning of it, it was great. We watched that one, and then we watched Star Trek after that. So, yeah, that started everything.
Cool. So let's talk about Descent of the Vial a little bit. So how did this is your most recent work, isn't it? The series?
It's the most recent novel, yes.
Okay. So how did this come to be?
Well, that one is probably a dream as well. It's kind of a weird story. So I watched the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy back to back, all three films. Mm-hmm. And I had a nightmare that night for some reason, even though they're comedy horror films. I, for some reason, had a nightmare. And it was the opening sequence to Descent of the Vial. And I thought, when I woke up, I had this idea that the rest of the story. And I thought, well, why not make that a novel? Why not write the rest of it or a novella? I guess I planned on it being a novella. And so why, there's a journey that you come out of this. It's not just this one part. And so I had the idea of what the strangers were going to be, and that it wasn't going to be what it initially appeared they were going to be. Yeah. And so, I just sort of expanded on it. I wrote it as a novella. It didn't work as a novella. It was just too short, and I had to cut too much out to keep it at that length. So I finally just went back and revised it and wrote the rest of it to make it a short novel.
The context of Descent is reminiscent of a zombie apocalypse scenario, or any kind of scenario where all social institutions have broken down and people are left to sort of fend for themselves without any kind of governance whatsoever. But there's a fairly large twist here that I'm not going to go into because it is one of the things that makes the book quite unique. So it's backing away from that. How did you become interested in this setting where, social institutions are leveled and people have to fend for themselves and things are kind of unruly?
Yeah, I guess part of it was the trilogy, of course, that I watched, because I felt like those films. I mean, starting out with the first one, of course, which was Shaun of the Dead. I sort of thought that they did it very well, in a way, because it was about these ordinary people who were faced with this horrifying situation. And although they did it as a comedy, it didn't have to be. It could have been done differently. And I guess I was sort of, it was the idea that ordinary people would be thrown into these extraordinary situations, and the idea that anyone can make a difference, the idea that anybody can succeed, anybody can, change things, change the future, change everything. And so I guess I kind of like that idea. The idea that there's more to life than just what you're thrown into, and you can make a difference and change your life, have a second chance at anything you want. And so, and I like the idea of him being a little older. It doesn't specify in book one, but it does in book two, that he's a little bit older. So he's not old, but 40s, I guess. So younger than me. But but I like the idea of.
This is Jackson, the main character.
Yeah, Jackson, because he's, most sci-fi I end up reading has to do with people who are, coming of age, or they're still in their 20s, still young, still, I'm like, of course they can make a difference, of course, but nobody thinks of older people being able to make a difference. And I'm like, oh, definitely they can, anybody can. So I like the idea of having a protagonist who wasn't in his 20s or younger, and I like the idea of him and Nadine, I guess, both being in different stages of their lives, so that they face the whole crisis differently, and that they actually react differently to the whole situation. And he ends up, kind of not really shutting down, but because he doesn't, he kind of tries to, I guess, reason his way out of it, and she
Hmm.
shuts down.
Hmm. Yeah. I haven't heard an answer of that type before to narrating, or at least choosing this sort of post-apocalyptic setting, that it's sort of using a post-apocalyptic setting as an interruption for sort of the drudgery and monotony of everyday life, and as almost an opportunity for people to step up into a better role.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, and it was definitely part of it because I felt like
Hmm.
it wasn't. It's sort of an interruption, but I
Hmm.
feel like it's an opportunity as well, like
Hmm.
you're saying, because people don't always realize what they're capable of until crisis hits them, and then you're
Hmm.
able to sometimes climb out of it, sometimes you don't, but
Hmm.
oftentimes you do, and you're able to do more than you ever realized you could, and so
Hmm.
yeah, I just felt like it was an opportunity
Yeah.
for these ordinary people to face something really bad.
Yeah, but phrasing it as an opportunity in that way is quite unique. I mean, I've read, especially after COVID, a
Yes.
lot of people were almost fantasizing about some sort of apocalypse, but that fantasy was very different. It seemed as though the vast majority of them were looking for a sort of social context in which there were no rules, and they could just go around and maybe shoot whoever they want or do whatever they want without consequence.
Yeah.
And that's a very different kind of opportunity than the one you're presenting here, because this one's
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
dealing with, yeah, I don't quite want to say self-discovery. That might be jumping the gun a little bit.
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying for sure,
Yeah.
because definitely, and they could have approached it very differently, and
Hmm.
and maybe some other people who were in this situation that were not actually presented in the novel did take it that way, and
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
and maybe we find that out in later
Okay.
installments.
Okay. Gonna get a slightly more dark side of the second
Perhaps.
book. We'll get to that question a little bit
Yeah.
later. Cool. All right. So this partially explains my second question. The shape of the novel is, I don't want to say unorthodox, but it's unique, and unique in a very interesting way. And the two characters, Nadine and Jackson, spend a huge amount of time driving around, like literally in circles. It wasn't boring, but um, it wasn't what I would expect in a novel of this type. Could you maybe describe your thought process as you designed this portion of the novel?
Yeah. I guess I thought of it as going back to the beginning. So at
Hmm.
first, they're trying to, escape, and that's their first thought is just escape, get away from wherever this is, and then it starts to
Hmm.
become clearer that maybe there is no escape. There, it's everywhere, and so I was sort of thinking of it as, I guess, like when you when you do anything and try to do it again a second time, it's never exactly the same.
Hmm.
So I was thinking of it as them trying to go back to the beginning and change things as if they're trying to change history, which you can't do.
Okay.
So I suppose I designed that around that thought that if they go back, it's not going to be the same as it was. And of course, it wasn't. It was
Hmm.
nothing like they had
Right.
originally seen. So it's sort of like, if you try to go back and like even if you're just going back home, like when if you go away for a while and you come back and it's different, it's never,
Hmm.
so I was sort of thinking of that, but
Okay.
also thinking that they needed to go on this journey, and part of the journey is them learning about everything, learning about what's going on, learning what's actually happening, and
Hmm.
part of it is them learning to live with each other because they're sort of thrust in the situation where you know and that goes into another question, of course, which I'm not going to get into the character development just yet, but
Hmm.
definitely they needed to learn to live together because as far as they know, they're the only people who are left, and so
Hmm.
they end up actually not just going on a journey of discovery, learning about each other, but they learn about themselves.
Hmm.
So it was sort of, I guess, being like trying to just, it's hard to just think of what I'm thinking because I did make notes
Yeah.
and I can't read them. So my writing is horrible.
It
So,
sounds like every day of my life.
right, yeah, no, my writing is so bad. Honestly,
Yeah.
and nobody could ever read it. They always used to ask me to
Hmm.
type everything. I'm like, yeah, I don't have a typewriter right now, so I wish I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Well, usually what I would expect to find, or what's normally found in post-apocalyptic novels such as this, is you get maybe a group of people or one person or a couple of people, and they
Hmm.
drive around, they try and escape whatever threat is in the area, and
Right.
the external threat turns out to be a major threat, but also it's the threat of other people without
Hmm.
all these social institutions to govern behavior. And
Yes.
it's not part of your novel at all. And I
Yeah.
actually had to read this middle section twice because I think, okay, when something's going to happen, when is something going to happen? I'm like, hold on a second. This is not about examining what human nature is when all
Yeah.
social institutions break down, because the point of a lot of these books is, okay,
Mm.
when social institutions break down, people turn into animals. They're just fighting for resources. And it's very
Yes.
much not what's going on here. And it
Yes.
kind of took me, oh, what's she doing here? And then I realized, okay, this is about Jackson and it's about Nadine.
Yes.
And what's going on outside them, that's kind of, it's important, but it's really secondary
Yes.
to,
It's the setting for the real story. Yeah.
right. Hmm. Yeah. And that's one really cool thing about post-apocalyptic settings, is that it allows you to do stuff like you did
Yes. Yes.
right here.
And I felt like it was
Yeah.
important to have a setting where they didn't really encounter that many people, so that they could
Hmm.
actually go through all of that development with learning
Hmm.
about each other and themselves and all of that they couldn't probably have done if they had run into several other people. And
Hmm.
also, I felt it important to stress how few people were left in the world, because
Yeah.
I feel like if they had run into people everywhere they went, like at first, of course, they run into a couple people, but then later on they don't. And
Hmm.
the reason for that is, of course, that the people are not there. So
Hmm.
I feel like it needed to be stressed that there were very, very, very few left.
Hmm.
Otherwise, the grid would still be up. There would still be some modern conveniences would still be there. And
Hmm.
as the story progresses, of course, those things disappear, which of course
Hmm.
increases the obstacles they have to overcome.
Yeah. Hmm. Yep. And I don't know how they were physically living on prepackaged pastries,
Right.
cold cans of soup, and
I
bags of
know.
chips.
And actually, some of that came from actual experiences because, I've been on a few road trips, and you sort of subsist on these things for a short time,
Yeah.
and which is not fun. I
Hmm.
mean, the trips are fun anyway. I mean, you can do it for a
Hmm.
short time if
Sure.
you don't have to, but when you absolutely have
Hmm.
to, it's a miserable experience.
Hmm.
So, and the whole thing with them eating those sandwiches that they gag on, that was a real experience that I actually had.
Oh,
Yes. Yeah,
wow.
we went into this. It was a convenience store in Wyoming, and nothing against Wyoming, it's beautiful, but we went into this convenience store in Wyoming, and they kind of looked at us weird when we bought the sandwiches, and we're like, "What's wrong with them?" Like, we didn't know, and I guess they were probably been in there too long and nobody was buying
Yeah.
them, and
Uh,
they gave us this weird look, and we're like, "What?" And then we're eating them in the car. We're like, "Oh God, they're stale. They're so stale.
oh,
They're beyond stale." And we're like, "Well, why
uh,
didn't you throw them away if you knew they were stale? Why
yeah.
were they still in the fridge?" So,
Hmm.
so that was based on a real experience, and I
Oh,
did
that's
try to put things like that in the novel.
mhm.
Just they're just little scattered things.
Very fortunate you didn't get physically sick or food poisoning from that
Right?
kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, and
Because
they
yeah,
weren't rotten; they were just stale. So
okay, it's
you
kind of
can eat them; they just don't taste very
yeah,
good.
yeah. It's the lowest grade of bodily fuel you can
Right?
get at that point.
It was pretty bad. It was so bad. I could only eat half of it, and
Uh-huh.
so yeah, I thought, well, that makes sense that would be in this story, right?
Oh yeah.
So I'm
Hmm.
like, yeah,
It
I'll
does.
put that in there.
So, building off of this, let's talk a little bit about each character. And Nadine, who's the woman in the story, isn't. At first, I thought, oh, she's not really developed that much because she's suffering from trauma, and she speaks very little. And
Yes.
then, as I said, I had to read the second part again after I figured out what was why it was structured the way it was. But
Yes.
this lack of speech or lack of communication, or at least lack of speech, is itself a kind of character development. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about Nadine?
Yeah. Well, she is a transplant from France, of course, and she came
Hmm.
over to live with this guy that she met. And so she's still building her life when she, of course, is uprooted by this whole, post-apocalyptic scenario. And so she's at a different point. She ends up, with this major trauma, where she, witnesses the death of this guy she fell in love with. And they had a fight just before. So she doesn't ever get to actually exercise her demons and apologize. So she has this major trauma from that. And she's just trying to make sense of everything. She's trying to, come to terms with the loss, in addition to the loss of the world that she knew. And the world that she knew in France, the world that she knew now in the United States, that she was still getting to know. And she doesn't really trust Jackson, I guess. She knows he saved her, but she doesn't know what his motivations are. She doesn't know necessarily what he's planning to do with her, if anything. And so she just ends up just really not participating much because she's just terrified. She's scared. And she doesn't really know, I guess, what's going to happen to her. And, she's like, is this better than if I had just died there on the street or not? So that's kind of what I was thinking when I wrote her character. I was thinking, she's just, if she talks about it, which is probably the best thing, for her therapy wise, I suppose. But if she talks about it, then, of course, she's reliving it. And every time she relives it, it's just this horror that she doesn't really want to relive.
Yeah. I can understand that when people try and get someone else to, you need to talk about this. You need to talk about this.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not the best way of addressing trauma sometimes, or at least in that direct way.
Because when I remember, I went through this horrible car accident. It was actually the day after 9/11, and I went through this horrible car accident. And I sort of, in my mind, combined the two events because I was so horrified by 9/11, and then having this car accident the very next day was just, I was having nightmares. They were horrific. And it was very difficult to talk about it in therapy. It was because then I had to actually talk about both events, and they were both so horrific. I just didn't really want to deal with it. And it ended up delaying the recovery because then I ended up having a relapse of the post-traumatic stress syndrome coming a year later. So, and then I had all over again, the nightmares and everything all over again. It was awful.
It's pretty close to you then.
Yeah.
So, and those concerns that Nadine has would be perfectly legitimate concerns.
Yes,
understandable concerns.
Nadine is like, she's still young. I mean, she was, a university student, so she's still fairly young, and so she, she doesn't have the experience to fall back on that Jackson does, I guess, to be able to deal with the situation.
So let's talk about Jackson a little bit. He doesn't seem like the normal type of guy one would find in a post-apocalyptic world where consequences for questionable action are oftentimes non-existent. Can you maybe talk a little bit about Jackson?
Yeah, Jackson was, he was an established career guy. He was a respected freelance photographer. And, he had kind of gotten to this point in his career where he was almost bored by it. Like the joy of creation was kind of gone because he's not being able to be very creative anymore. And so I think, the luster from this career that he's chosen is kind of faded a bit. And he's kind of more of a logical kind of person. He's trying to reason his way through this whole thing. And, he sees Nadine as kind of a puzzle. And I felt like having him be the main character and his perspective being the only one we saw kind of, sort of amplified, I guess, the mystery that we get from Nadine, because Nadine is so quiet and throughout, and we're seeing her from his perspective. And he doesn't understand her, and he wants to protect her, but he also he has this fear that he is not the one to protect her. He feels he's going to fail in this whole endeavor, and he wants to drop her off with someone else. And I think he even says that somewhere in the first part of the book, that if he finds somewhere safe, he'll leave her there. But of course, what he doesn't admit to himself is that he doesn't trust anyone else with her either.
Fair
So
point.
yeah, so he's like, so he had a couple of opportunities to drop her off and he didn't take them because he again just didn't know what they would do with her, and he just feels this. It's not really. It's a protective instinct, I guess, but it's sort of like he doesn't want to lose his humanity, I suppose. That he's afraid that the loss of civilization is going to end up, destroying him as much as everyone else, and he's just terrified of that.
Yeah,
so,
he's protective, but it's not creepy protective. It's not. It's not like you're my possession. I'm going to take you with me everywhere. It's more...
He just ends up, just deciding that, he feels like if everything, if humanity is to survive in any extent, then the two of them need to make it, and they both need to make it with, I guess, their personalities intact, and not just actually just survive at the bare minimum, but actually, keep some of their humanity, at least some of it.
Yeah.
And I remember he was afraid at one point because he said that he was worried about whether they would end up stealing, and he didn't even want to steal. He didn't want to. Yeah. But then, of course, there's no more people, right? So he's not stealing from anyone. He's just, basically rooting through supplies that are left behind. But he doesn't even like doing that. He's disgusted by it.
Yeah, it's called survival at that point.
Yes. At that point, yes. But he doesn't even like doing that. So
yeah, probably. Oh, this is looting. This is like how the people at Katrina were framed, at least by the news media. Which is really an unfair framing.
I agree, and he's like this kind of. He's kind of uptight a bit. He's a little bit kind of a stickler for rules, as you can kind of tell, and the idea of breaking any kind of rule is just abhorrent to him, and he doesn't like even in that worst case scenario. He's like, ew, no. So yeah.
Let me circle back to this point you made a little bit earlier about him when you mentioned he's maybe burned out or maybe a little bit disillusioned with his job as a freelance photographer. And it explains a little bit more his demeanor at the very beginning of the book, where he's taking photographs of these strange objects. And it turns out, he has said it's a really weird photo shoot because he has to take pictures of a whole bunch of things. He has no idea what they are. The people who are guiding him are being very strange. They're being sort of, not, I don't want to say mean to him, but dismissive.
And kind of aloof. They're not really explaining things, and then instead they're more interested in like the orientation of the objects in the photos than actually explaining what he's doing.
Yeah, and it doesn't take long for him to just lapse into this mindset where he's thinking, I don't care what these stupid things are. I'll just take the daggone pictures and let me get out of here. Whatever, if this is some kind of weird second degree performance art, or if these are sculptures, they don't look like sculptures, but I'm just taking pictures of the daggone things and then I'm leaving. And it sets up his personality to see an opportunity in this post-apocalypse, but at least respond to it and get jolted out of it.
Yes. And I think he ends up seeing it differently, partly because of the fact that he was a bit jaded. It's definitely different than what he's been dealing with before. So for him, it's an opportunity to find out what he's made of. In addition, and I think he kind of welcomes this, in as much as he hates it and is terrified of it, because he hasn't gotten to show much of his creative side. He hasn't gotten to actually think in a long time. He's just kind of going through the motions, and he's a bit tired of it, I think, as much as he hates what actually happens. I don't think that's what he had envisioned, but
right. Yeah.
I don't think he wanted the apocalypse to happen, but
that's one heck of a midlife crisis right there.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So poor guy. And as much as I kind of, enjoyed writing the book, I kind of felt bad for him in a way, like I was like, oh my God, all this horrible stuff is happening to these poor people. But, of course I couldn't stop writing the book. Right. So, and I'm one of those people who, when I write, I end up, like, if it gets really bad, I cry.
Mhm.
I cry for what's happening to them. I cry when they're upset.
Mhm.
I'm so weird. I've heard other people love it. They get so excited about it, and I am like the opposite. I cry
Mhm.
every time something bad happens to my characters. It's my fault, but I'm crying.
Yeah. I've talked to other authors who are like, ha ha ha, I'm going to make the readers cry when I kill off this
Yeah,
character.
exactly. And I'm like the opposite. I'm like, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Got to do it. Plot requires it. Tough.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. It's
Uh,
it's interesting because after talking about this, I can see in the different ways Jackson and Nadine react to this apocalypse. At no point does Jackson really say, "Oh, I really just wish I had my old life back." And he does say
yes.
things like, "I wish none of this had ever happened," but he doesn't say, "I really miss how things were like a year ago. Wouldn't it be great
Yeah.
if we could just go back in time?" And Nadine is the opposite. She's just like, I just want to go back to my life with my boyfriend.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
great. And this all sucks. And they're both like, yeah, this sucks. But
Yeah.
Jackson's more looking to the future. Near the end, he's saying, it would be kind of nice to have a house and, an art studio where I could really, truly release my
Yeah.
creative
What he
energy.
want? Yeah. I think he's thinking of it as a new start, whereas
Hmm.
I think she's at the end. By the end, I mean, she kind of embraces that idea of starting over a
Yep.
little more. But of
Hmm.
course, at the beginning, she is just, all she wants is to go back. She almost wishes she could go back to France, I think.
Hmm.
But of course, she misses her boyfriend, and she really fell for the guy, even though she hadn't known him as long as
Hmm.
maybe she knew him long enough and well enough through correspondence that she wanted to move in with the guy. I mean, she knew him that
Hmm.
well, at least, but
Hmm.
she she never got to actually say goodbye either, and I think that's kind of
Yep.
hard. She
Yeah. Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
really. She has this kind of door that's always going to be kind of open a little bit, looking to the past, where it's never really going to go away.
Mm. That's, yeah, it just dawned on me that there are different reactions right there. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
So I don't want to go into maybe the last 30 pages or so, because that's where things really take a twist and we find out what's going on. And I'd like to leave that under the sort of fog of war, as it
Yes.
were. But it's very interesting what happens there. So there's a
Yeah.
sequel to this. I forgot the title already.
It's
The
called The
Hotel?
Blood Hotel.
The Blood Hotel. Right.
Yeah.
Without giving away what happens at the end of book 1, what can we expect from The Blood Hotel?
Well, it's going to be a bit darker and more intense in tone. It's
more dark and more intense.
Yeah, more dark and more intense. Yes. So it starts out. The story in Descent of the Vial starts out a little slower, and some of this was so it would be kind of more of a jolt when everything starts to happen. But I also realized that maybe that wasn't the way I would do it if I wrote it today. But but I still am proud of the story. But the Sin of the Vial is a little different from the Blood Hotel in that the Blood Hotel starts out almost instantly. The very beginning of the story is the start of the action. So it's a little more intense in that way. Also, because of course the previous book deals with an apocalypse, there's no technology for them to deal with. They don't have any cars or gasoline or anything like that. It takes place 5 years after the events in Descent of the Vial. So they don't have any modern technology at all. And there's a return of a familiar foe that they suddenly have to fight again. And they don't have any, means of fighting this. And so it's sort of how they deal with it, how they choose to go about not just fighting the foe, but going on with their lives, how they end up facing
adapting to the new situation in whatever way that might be.
Yes. Yay.
Cool. So, and this is out. This is released. Both of these are released. The Blood Hotel is as well.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, The Blood Hotel is also released right now, correct?
Yes, it is out.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, Descent of the Vial won a couple awards, didn't it?
It won one award, which I am happy about. It won a Literary Titan Silver Award, and it is it hasn't been entered in that many other awards, which is probably one reason it hasn't won that many. But I just really didn't have the funds, so it didn't get entered in that many. But it did win that one. And the previous one, the The House of Wind Lift actually is the one that won an honorable mention in the 2022, I should specify 2022, Indies Today Awards. And it also won the
Cool.
Gold Award with Literary Titan. So,
right on. Congratulations on both of
thank
those.
you.
It's a fantastic
Thank you so much.
accomplishment.
Yeah,
Cool. So you're published through a small independent press. Is that correct?
that is correct. It's World Castle Publishing is the press, small press.
Okay. Cool. What's your experience been with a small publisher? How's that worked for you?
It was great actually, because I didn't really have the money to pay for the artwork, to pay for the editing and all of that. So I thought that if I went with a small press, it would be probably, I wouldn't need an agent for one, which would be even more money coming out of my royalties, which I didn't really want to do at the time. And so I thought, well, if I go with a small press, they'll pay for the artwork, they'll pay for the editing, they'll do all of that themselves. And so that was ideal for me, because I had lost my job at the time, and I just really didn't have any funds for anything. And I was really hoping that it would help, and it did, because they've been great. I mean, one thing about World Castle is that they allow you to keep the rights. So the rights are mine to these books.
Oh, okay. That's different.
Yeah, very different. And so, they're great for that. And, there's some distribution issues, like not as many people know about them as if I was with one of the big five, which, that's harder to do than it sounds, of course, to go with the big five. So I'm happy with them overall.
Cool. That's good to hear. Well, let's see. What can we expect from you in the future?
Well, I have a couple of manuscripts that I am still polishing, and one is a space opera kind of science fantasy thing that I am still trying to revise. I got some feedback from a couple of beta readers, and overall it's positive, so I'm just trying to make the last minute changes to that one. And then I have another one that I may start querying very soon. It is a classic good versus evil story with a little bit of a twist. And that one kind of harks back to classic science fiction movies and TV. And I love the story. And so far, that's the one that most of my beta readers have said it's their favorite of everything I've written. So,
cool.
So yeah, I hope it will be published in the near future. I'm just not ready to decide exactly what I want to do with it, but I think I want to query it. So, we'll see.
Okay, awesome. Well, Cheryl, it's been wonderful talking with you. And yeah, I wish you all the success as an author and a wonderful future ahead of you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that very much.
Okay, fantastic. We'll talk soon.
Okay, thanks.